There's a fundamental change that's taking place in terms of how we solve problems and even govern ourselves on this shrinking planet. We're seeing the rise of new multi-stakeholder networks. It's kind of a mouthful, but it means networks involving companies, civil society organizations, governments, individuals. And they work together using the internet, and they're attacking every problem on the planet. And these networks are today engaging tens of thousands of organizations and tens of millions of people every day. Now, there are a number of profound drivers for this change. The first one is we have a demand pull for a whole new model of how we solve problems in the world. If you look at the world today, we have lots of problems. And if you inventory them, many of them are not getting better, they're getting worse. Some, you could argue, are improving. Poverty in the developing world is inching, it's glacial, but it's inching forward. But even in the developed world, poverty is arguably, it's getting greater. And there's much discussion today about growing social inequality. Other problems are clearly getting worse, sometimes with frightening implications. Climate change would be a big one. I remember at Davos, Bill Clinton was saying to a number of us, if we reduce carbon emissions by 80% in the year 2050, it'll still take 1,000 years for the planet to cool down, and in the meantime, some bad things are going to happen. He says you can look at 1.5 billion to 2 billion people losing more than half of their water supply in the next 10 to 15 years. Parts of the world becoming deserts, like California. So, are these problems just too hard to solve, or is our model wrong? Well, what's our model? The anniversary of our approach to solving global problems in the world was 70 years ago in Bretton Woods, New Hampshire. All the Allied forces, the winners of the war, 42 countries came together and they created the World Bank and the IMF. A year later, they broadened the group and created the United Nations. And a year later, UNESCO. And a year later, the International Standards Organization. And eventually, the GATT and the WTO, and then the G20 and the G8. These are all global institutions that are based on nation states. They're controlled by nation states. The trouble is that the nation state is kind of the wrong size for these global problems. If you're a problem, you don't really know about boundaries that much. The climate is not familiar with the concept of boundaries. So let me just give you an example. You have a whole bunch of nation states that meet around this topic of climate change in Cancun and Copenhagen and Rio and so on, and they really can't come up with meaningful agreements. So pick a typical country. I won't name one. But say you have, if you're lucky, 60% of the electorate votes. Then the winning party may get, I don't know, say 40% of the vote, and that's enough to get them into power. That's 24% now of the citizens. What percent of those people would agree with a particular point of view that's being presented by the government? Should we give them half? Well, we're now down to 12%. Then there are all the young people who can't vote, all the immigrants who are stakeholders but don't have a say. You're looking at representatives, the legitimate representatives of all these sovereign states saying we represent our country, and arguably they're really reflecting, say, 7 or 8% of the population's views. Meanwhile, there are all these other perspectives, all these other layers, all these other points of views that don't get represented. So we need to have a new model, and that's the first driver, a demand pull for a whole new approach to solving problems in the world.